Thank you for listening and supporting the Daily Memphian. Sign up for one of our many free newsletters and breaking news alerts at dailymemphian.com/email to receive the latest local news stories impacting our community. Our weekly newsletters cover everything from sports to arts and culture, business, food, and more, along with daily updates of all the news we publish each day. Sign up or manage your email preferences at dailymemphian.com/email.
I'm Bill Dries with the Daily Memphian. We are talking with Steve Mulroy, a candidate for District Attorney General in the May Shelby County primary election, and this is On the Record. We record this Wednesday, March 23rd, 2022. This is one of three On the Record podcasts with the three candidates for District Attorney General in the Democratic primary featured in our comprehensive story about the primary race. The winner of the primary meets Republican incumbent District Attorney General Amy Weirich in the August county general election. Weirich is unopposed in the May Republican primary. Steve Mulroy is a former Shelby County Commissioner and a professor at the University of Memphis Law School. He is also a former Justice Department attorney working in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department on voting rights and other cases. Well, Steve, several national criminal justice reform groups have gotten involved in this challenge of the incumbent without backing at this point any of the three Democratic challengers and with a lot of criticism of Amy Weirich's record. First off the top, how closely aligned are you with what those groups are doing politically in this race?
Okay, good question. First, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be on the podcast. And also, when you were reciting my background, it might also bear mention that I was a former federal prosecutor as well.
Absolutely.
I have not really been working closely with those national groups at all. I have had contact with them. I have spoken to them, but I know nothing about what they're doing in terms of public messaging in the race. So, I know as much about that as you do. When something appears, I'm as surprised as the rest of you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about what is at stake here that all three of the contenders in this primary have talked about and agree on, and that is change in the district attorney's office. Why do you think there needs to be change in that office?
Well, there are a number of different reasons why we need change, Bill, and I think the record speaks for itself. Our district attorney's office is number one in the state for prosecutorial violations, ethical misconduct, improper comments to the jury, failure to disclose evidence, leading to overturned conviction. And not only the office in general, but Weirich herself has been called out for such conduct in 7 different cases, including by the Tennessee Supreme Court, the highest federal court of appeals in this region, and an ethics panel of the state bar. But more important than that, maybe, or aside from that, independent from that, not only are we worst in the state in terms of prosecutorial misconduct, but we're worst in the state in terms of use of the death penalty, in transferring juvenile defendants to adult court, where they end up serving adult prison sentences, which are essentially crime college sentences with no rehabilitative services. That just creates more recidivism. Over 95% of those adult transfers in juvenile court are African American. We're first in the state for racially disproportionate outcomes. In fact, in juvenile court, we were under Department of Justice supervision for several years, in which there were scathing reports about the prosecutor's office role in those racially disproportionate outcomes. And we're first in the state for the number of people who were languishing pretrial at 201 Poplar, who haven't been convicted of a single crime, for the simple reason that they can't afford cash bail. And when we talk about common sense reforms to address some of these issues, bail reform, juvenile justice reform, things that have been proven to work in peer cities, or when we talk about a conviction review unit, like they have had successfully in Nashville for years, which has resulted in uncovering a number of different miscarriages of justice, the consistent response from the Republican incumbent is to oppose those reforms, supposedly on the ground that it's necessary to keep us safe. But Bill, I think it's obvious to anybody who's paying attention that we haven't been kept safe. Violent crime was actually going down in the 3 years before Wyrick took office in 2011 and has been rising steadily, increasing almost every single year in the last 10 years that she's been in office, to the point where we're now number one, not in the state, but in the country for violent crime per capita. Now, I don't blame her solely for all of that, but I think the steady increase in crime shows that what we've been doing hasn't been working, and we definitely need a change.
Do you think that more punishment for repeat offenders, or truth in sentencing, which is no parole, no probation, is a deterrent to crime?
No, I don't think so. And I think the record suggests strongly that that's the case. And I think that Governor Bill Lee, who is himself pretty conservative, agrees with me. He himself has been saying recently that the truth in sentencing thing may not be the way to go, and we need to focus more on prevention. There was a task force that reported to Governor Lee a couple of years ago that the reduction in parole and increase in length of sentencing approach has been tried previously in Tennessee history and has not been working. And a member of that task force was Amy Wyrick herself. I don't think that abolishing parole, which, let's be realistic, that's essentially what truth in sentencing is, really does anything helpful. What it does is it removes incentives for prisoners to rehabilitate, to learn a trade, to behave themselves while they're in prison, and just increases the chance that they'll become recidivists upon their eventual release.
As a county commissioner, you had somewhat of an oversight role for the district attorney's office. The district attorney's budget came through the county commission, still does. What did that oversight role tell you about how the office has been run? And what does that experience tell you now about what possible changes you might make if you win the primary and then the general?
Right. Well, so when I was doing oversight of the prosecutor's office, I noted that we were the Texas of Tennessee when it came to the death penalty. We were an outlier, and that death penalty prosecutions were hugely expensive. One of the reasons why other rural counties in Tennessee don't pursue death penalty prosecutions is because they're so expensive to do. I remember that from my oversight role. I also remember pointing out the unconstitutional practice of what was then called the 48-hour hold process, where the law enforcement would hold people on less than probable cause for up to 48 hours, essentially an attempt to sweat them into a confession. And this was happening with the active cooperation of the prosecutor's office. I eventually got that practice stopped and wrote a law review article, in fact, about how there were several other cities that did this unconstitutional practice as well. And that law review article was cited by the U.S. Justice Department in their report on the Ferguson, Missouri situation, if you recall that from a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So, oversight did give me some insights into what was going on. And I think in terms of what I would do differently, I think that I would more robustly explore alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenses so that we can better marshal our limited resources on violent crime, which absolutely has to be our top priority because it's out of control in Memphis and Shelby County. I would also pursue bail reform. I would pursue juvenile justice reform, and I would establish a conviction review unit. There are other things I would do as well, but I think I would stop there as main priorities.
And we've talked at several points here about juveniles who are transferred for trial as adults. How would that process work if you were elected to this? And how does it work now?
Well, right now, we have a culture in which pretty much whenever a juvenile defendant is statutorily eligible for adult transfer, a notice of adult transfer is filed. Sometimes it's filed because the prosecutors really do want adult transfer. And in some of those situations, I think that's inappropriate. Other times they're doing it sort of to get bargaining leverage. And this practice of what the Department of Justice monitor called gamesmanship in her final report was criticized by the Equal Protection and due process monitors of the Department of Justice. I think I would, and in fact, she called that and the prosecutor's refusal to provide discovery to the defense during this part of the process, quote, a toxic combination for African-American youth, unquote. What I would do differently is I would issue guidelines to the line attorneys, creating a strong presumption against adult transfer. We need to treat kids as kids. And wherever possible, we need to keep juvenile defendants in juvenile court where there's a broader array of rehabilitative services available. So absent extreme cases, where the juvenile is approaching the age of majority and has a lengthy record of violent crime, and the crime itself is extremely serious, and there are indications in the record that rehabilitation is not going to be a realistic option. Absent those extreme cases, the strong presumption should be against adult transfer. And I'll also note, Bill, that I think I mentioned before, 95% of these adult transfer cases are Black in a county that's only 50% Black. So I think I would also issue guidelines that would try to make sure that we measured carefully whether we were improving with our racially disproportionate outcomes in treatment in juvenile court, and make sure that we were bending the curve on that. And I guess specifically, I should also mention that requests for adult transfer from line attorneys would have to be approved either by the district attorney himself or one of the top lieutenants in the supervisor's office.
Mm-hmm. What factor does protecting the public from someone who has been in juvenile court for violent offenses or violent charges several times versus what might be seen as a chance at rehabilitation despite those violent offenses?
Well, so protecting the public from violent crime has to be the number one priority of any district attorney. And it would be if I were district attorney. That's unconditional. It absolutely is the top priority, second to no other priority. However, treating juveniles as juvenile defendants in juvenile court is not inconsistent with that goal. The studies show that when you take juvenile defendants and you place them in adult prison, they become more likely to be recidivists upon their eventual release. So you're not actually keeping people safe. You are making the crime problem worse. But not to mention the fact that it also significantly increases the risk of suicide or sexual assault for those defendants. So it is both more humane and also more cost-effective in terms of bending the curve on violent crime to keep juvenile defendants in juvenile court and apply those rehabilitative services precisely because we want to reduce the risk that they'll be repeat offenders.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the public who are not attorneys, are not at 201 Poplar on a daily basis, do you think the public that is going to decide this primary in this election see the district attorney as merely one side of two in a battle between what some attorneys I know have called zealous advocates, one side making the best case for guilt and the other making the best case for acquittal? Is it that simple?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that two different ways. First of all, every lawyer has a duty of zealous advocacy. That's an ethical responsibility. And that was the case when I was a federal prosecutor. And it would be the case in terms of anybody who worked under me if I were district attorney. But the prosecutor also has a special role at the outset to decide whether to bring a case and what charges to bring and what kind of sentence to recommend. And the prosecutor has a goal not just to rack up as many convictions as possible or to put people behind bars for as many years as possible. It's not just to win at all costs. It's to do substantive justice. So the prosecutor has a special ethical duty to be zealous in those cases that they decide to bring, but at the same time tempering it with what is ultimately the correct result. And as to the public, the voting public, I think that the public has an intuitive sense that there's such a thing as an overzealous prosecutor. And I think the public in Shelby County has it into in a sense that we've become overzealous in Shelby County, and that has led to racial unfairness and racially disproportionate outcomes. I think the voters, even if they're not skilled in the law, have an intuitive sense that there needs to be zealous advocacy tempered by fairness, particularly racial fairness. And we are out of balance right now. I think that's definitely true among the Democratic primary voters, but I also think it's true among the general election voters in Shelby County as well.
You, as well as the two other contenders in the Democratic primary, have all talked about a culture change in the office. What does that look like on day one if the incumbent is defeated and one of you takes that office? And in your case, do you clean house? Do a lot of prosecutors who are there and have been there for a while, do they leave? Is that even possible given the workload and the ongoing work that the district attorney's office has?
Well, it's certainly possible. I think there are many talented lawyers, both in Shelby County and around the country, who would welcome an opportunity to work in the district attorney's office of Shelby County and take part in a reform effort. So I think it's certainly possible. But, mass firings aren't necessary either. I think what an enlightened district attorney would do would be to meet with each individual line attorney and find out, how enthusiastic they are for changing the culture and, are reforming the criminal justice system. And those that aren't on board with that, then they may seek other opportunities. And those that are on board with it, then can work with the new district attorney. I think there might be some need for some personnel change, especially at the leadership level, but mass firings wouldn't necessarily be required either. I think it would be a case-by-case basis. But I think you can change the culture even without personnel changes. And one of the things to do is to just send the message that the way to get promoted, the way to succeed, the way to advance is no longer pursuing a win-at-all-costs mindset that sometimes leads to lawyers approaching the ethical line, if not crossing it. That rather than, like I said before, racking up convictions and racking up years in prison, we're going to be using different metrics. We're going to be using metrics like, have we managed to reduce recidivism? Have we managed to reduce racial disproportionalities? If those are metrics that we replace the other metrics with, then I think that will also create a culture change in the office.
All right. A final point there. This has happened. There have been these kind of campaigns for other district attorneys' offices across the country. And there was a PBS documentary on the change in the prosecutor's office in Philadelphia, I believe, with a new reform-minded
Philly DA. I
right.
watched it. Yes, yep, I'm very familiar with it.
Are any of the points in that storyline, do you think, applicable to Shelby County?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a cautionary tale, and there are some important lessons there. One lesson is that a district attorney can't just go in and, change everything unilaterally, that they need to consult with all the different stakeholders in the community. So that's law enforcement, it's criminal justice reform groups, it's civil rights groups, it's church groups, it's the suburban mayors, it's victims' rights groups. Everybody needs to be consulted before you launch new initiatives. And the second lesson that I draw from that documentary is that there is inevitably resistance to change. There will be bureaucratic resistance to change, both from within the district attorney's office and from other actors in the governmental system. And I think, Bill, that speaks to one of my strengths as a Democratic candidate. I'm the only candidate in the race on the Democratic side that has actual experience in county government. I worked with county government bureaucracy for 8 years as a county commissioner. I still work with them now in my role as sort of a pro bono activist lobbyist of the county government. And when it comes to getting cooperation from other actors in the county government system, I think the relationships that I have from my experience in county government will also be of benefit. So to take one example, if we want to do bail reform, we're going to need to reform pretrial services, which makes the initial bail recommendations. They report directly to County Mayor Lee Harris. He and I are campaigning together. We've opened up a headquarters together. We've known each other for years since our time as law professors together. I can go to Mayor Harris and work with him on reforming pretrial services so that I can reform the bail system. Or to take just one more example, reentry services. We're going to need to beef up reentry services if we really want to reform the system and also get violent crime under control, which, again, has to be our top priority. Well, that's the county commission budget item. I used to be one of them. I'm still in touch with them. I can go to the county commission and make a plausible case for increasing reentry services. So I think those two lessons are lessons that I draw from the Philly DEA documentary. And I think, I'm biased, obviously, but I think they speak to my unique strengths as a Democratic candidate.
All right, that's where we will leave it. We have been talking with Steve Mulroy, a candidate in the May Democratic primary for District Attorney General in Shelby County. This is one of 3 interviews that are part of this article that you've been reading in the Daily Memphian, and you can hear all 3 of those interviews in their entirety. I'm Bill Dries, and this has been On the Record.